Picture yourself strapped into an aircraft you understand completely will be your coffin. The machine beneath you crawls through the sky like a wounded bird. Enemy fighters circle above like sharks sensing blood. This was reality for America's torpedo pilots at Midway. Their slow, fragile devastators carried death in their bellies. Not for the enemy, for themselves. The morning sun climbed higher over the Pacific. Below, waves sparkled innocently. Above, 37 American torpedo bombers droned toward the most powerful naval force Japan had ever assembled. Only 4 would see sunset again. What unfolded next shocked the Japanese admirals. It stunned American commanders. A massacre that should have ended in complete failure instead opened the door to the most stunning naval victory in military history. The Douglas TBD Devastator was already obsolete before the first shot was fired. These flying coffins maxed out at barely 200 miles per hour. Their armor was tissue paper. Their torpedoes were notorious duds that ran deep or simply refused to explode. Against them waited the legendary Mitsubishi Zero, swift as lightning, deadly as poison, unmatched in the Pacific skies. Every American pilot climbing into his cockpit knew the mathematics of survival. They were flying antiques against the finest fighter aircraft in the world. The odds were not merely poor. They were non-existent. Yet engines roared to life anyway. Propellers spun into blurred circles. One by one, these death traps lifted off carrier decks into the brilliant morning sky. Why would commanders order such slaughter? Why would young men accept missions that promised only martyrdom? The answer stretched back 6 months to a December morning in Hawaii. Pearl Harbor had shattered American confidence. The rising sun flag swept across the Pacific like wildfire. Japan seemed unstoppable, but in the shadows, American code breakers labored in secret. They hunched over encrypted messages at Station Hypo in Hawaii. Fragment by fragment, they pieced together Japan's next move. The target was a tiny speck of sand called Midway, barely more than an airstrip surrounded by coral. But its location was priceless real estate halfway between Tokyo and California. Admiral Yamamoto, the mastermind behind Pearl Harbor, saw Midway as the key to forcing America into surrender. If Japan seized this remote outpost, they could threaten Hawaii again, perhaps even the American mainland. The United States Navy scraped together what remained of their Pacific fleet. Enterprise, Hornet. The hastily patched Yorktown, still bearing scars from previous battles. 3 carriers against 4. Battered ships carrying obsolete aircraft. This was America's last hand in the Pacific poker game. Admiral Chester Nimitz understood the stakes completely. Lose here, and the war might be over before it truly began. Win, and perhaps the tide could turn. The Devastators were not chosen because they were good. They were chosen because they were available. These flying relics represented the only torpedo-striking force the Navy possessed. Their crews knew exactly what they were climbing into. Training had revealed every flaw in their aircraft. Practice runs had demonstrated the hopelessness of their torpedoes. Combat experience had shown them the superiority of Japanese fighters. Still, they climbed aboard. Still, they strapped themselves in. Still, they taxied toward takeoff position. Commander John Waldron gathered his pilots before dawn on June 4th. His words were simple, brutal, honest. "We're going in. We may not come back, but if we can land one blow, it will be worth everything." His men listened in silence. They understood. This was not about survival. This was about buying time, creating chaos, perhaps opening a crack that other American forces could exploit. The Pacific stretched endlessly in all directions. Blue water reflected morning sunlight like scattered diamonds. The Japanese fleet lay somewhere beyond the horizon, waiting. At 7 that morning, the first Devastator lurched forward. Its engine coughed and roared. The tail lifted as the pilot pulled back on his stick. Slowly, painfully, the ancient bomber clawed its way into the sky. Another followed. Then another. 37 total, rising like a funeral procession into the bright Pacific morning. The plan called for coordination. Dive bombers, fighters, and torpedo planes converging simultaneously on enemy carriers. A three-pronged attack that might overwhelm Japanese defenses. But the Pacific Ocean has its own agenda. Radio communications failed. Navigation errors scattered the formations. The vast emptiness swallowed careful timing. The Devastators found themselves alone. No fighter escort, no dive bombers above. Just 37 slow, vulnerable aircraft flying straight toward the most dangerous airspace in the world. They pressed forward anyway. Engines droned steadily. Propeller wash kicked up spray from the waves below. Mile after mile, they flew deeper into enemy territory. Then dark shapes appeared on the horizon. The Japanese carrier force. 4 massive flat tops surrounded by cruisers and destroyers. The most powerful naval striking force ever assembled. Alarms shrieked across the enemy fleet. Anti-aircraft guns swiveled toward the approaching threat. From high above came the dreaded sound every American pilot feared. The scream of diving Zeros. The sky exploded into chaos. Tracer bullets slashed through the air like deadly fireworks. Black puffs of anti-aircraft fire blossomed around the lumbering Devastators. The ancient American bombers were sitting ducks. Too slow to evade. Too fragile to absorb punishment. Their pilots hunched forward, throttles pushed to maximum, coaxing every ounce of speed from engines already pushed beyond their limits. Zero fighters fell upon them like wolves attacking sheep. Cannon shells ripped through thin aluminum skin. Fuel lines ruptured, streaming gasoline into the slipstream. Control surfaces shredded under the assault. One by one, the Devastators began falling. Some burst into flames, spiraling toward the ocean like burning meteors. Others simply disintegrated under the withering fire. Pilots had no time to bail out. Gunners died at their stations. Radio operators transmitted final messages that crackled into eternal silence. Yet the survivors pressed forward. Every remaining pilot held his course toward the Japanese carriers. Through walls of steel and fire, they aimed for their targets. The torpedoes they carried were as flawed as the planes delivering them. The notorious Mark 13 was famous for running too deep, for failing to detonate, for betraying the very men who risked everything to deliver it. To release these weapons required flying straight and level. Perfect targets for enemy gunners. Perfect victims for circling fighters. But they tried anyway. Through the storm of bullets and shells, the remaining Devastators lined up for their attack runs. They dropped to wave height. They steadied their aircraft. They released their torpedoes. Some weapons splashed harmlessly into the sea. Others ran beneath their targets without exploding. A few struck carrier hulls but failed to detonate. Not one single hit was scored. Not one enemy ship was damaged. The slaughter continued until the sky was empty of American torpedo planes. 33 had been destroyed. Only 4 limped away from the carnage, their aircraft riddled with holes, their crews bleeding from wounds. The ocean boiled with burning wreckage. Oil slicks spread across the waves. Fragments of wings and fuselage dotted the water like grotesque confetti. Commander Waldron was gone. Most of his squadron had followed him into the depths. Their sacrifice seemed utterly pointless. Only Ensign George Gay survived the destruction of Torpedo Squadron 8. Shot down and floating alone in the water, he would become the sole witness to what happened next. To Japanese eyes, the morning looked like complete victory. Their carriers remained untouched. Their Zero fighters had slaughtered the enemy attackers. The American torpedo squadrons were annihilated, but in their moment of triumph lay the seeds of their destruction. The Zero fighters had been drawn down to sea level. They were scattered in pursuit of the torpedo planes. Their formations were broken. Their fuel was running low. Most critically, their attention was focused downward on the slaughter below. They never saw the next wave of attackers approaching from high altitude. 20,000 feet above the chaos, American dive bombers had finally found their targets. The SBD Dauntless pilots had been delayed, confused, uncertain of enemy positions. Now they arrived at the perfect moment. The Japanese carriers were vulnerable. Their decks crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed, their fighter cover scattered at low altitude. The dive bombers tipped forward into screaming descents. Their engines howled as they plummeted toward the enemy fleet. From 20,000 feet, they had clear shots at sitting targets. At exactly 10:22 a.m., the first bomb struck Kaga. The explosion detonated fuel and ammunition across her flight deck. Flames engulfed the massive carrier within seconds. Moments later, Akagi took a direct hit. A single bomb ignited her hangar, sealing her fate. Soryu followed, blasted by 3 bombs in quick succession. In 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's finest carriers were mortally wounded. The sea that had witnessed the futile sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons now witnessed a miracle. The tide of battle had shifted with stunning suddenness. The Japanese Naval Air Force was gutted in a single morning. But this victory did not belong to the dive bombers alone. It was built upon the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons, the men who had flown straight into certain death. Their hopeless attack had drawn the Zero fighters away from altitude. Their destruction had created the opening that allowed the dauntless bombers to strike unopposed. Floating in the water among enemy ships, George Gay watched Japanese carriers burn. Columns of black smoke twisted skyward. The impossible had happened. His 33 squadron mates were gone. But their deaths had not been meaningless. Their sacrifice had broken the backbone of Japan's fleet. What had begun as massacre became the hinge point of the Pacific War. The torpedo planes had failed to score a single hit. Yet their courage had delivered the most decisive blow in naval history. The morning ended with Japan's carrier force in ruins. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu burned like funeral pyres. By evening, Hiryu would join them on the ocean floor. 4 of Japan's finest flat tops, destroyed in one day. The Naval Air Force that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months was shattered. From this blow, Japan would never recover. The cost had been staggering for the American torpedo squadrons. 33 crews had vanished forever. Entire squadrons were wiped from existence. Bunk rooms stood empty. Mess halls echoed with absent voices. For the 4 survivors limping back to their carriers, the mission felt like complete failure. They had scored no hits. Their comrades were dead. What had been accomplished? The answer would emerge gradually. Historians would recognize that without the torpedo squadron's sacrifice, the dive bombers might never have found their opening. The Japanese had been caught completely off guard. Their fighters were out of position. Their carriers were vulnerable. All because 37 obsolete bombers had flown straight into the jaws of death. This paradox gives Midway its haunting power. The greatest American naval victory was built upon apparent failure. Triumph emerged from tragedy. Victory was purchased with lives, not hits. For families back home, the news was devastating. Telegrams arrived bearing those dreaded words, "Missing in action." Wives became widows. Parents buried empty caskets. But as years passed, these same families learned their loved ones had not died in vain. Their sacrifice had helped win the most important battle of the Pacific War. George Gay carried the memory of his 33 comrades for the rest of his life. He spoke of them not as victims, but as heroes. Through him, their voices were never entirely silenced. Today, Midway is remembered as the turning point of the Pacific War. Behind that simple phrase lies the image of 37 obsolete aircraft droning toward certain destruction. Men gripping their controls, flying straight through walls of fire, knowing exactly what awaited them in those flak-filled skies. Their courage was not measured by success. It was defined by the willingness to try when trying meant dying. The legacy of Midway belongs not only to the carriers that sank, it belongs to the echo of 37 engines straining against fate, to the flames that consumed them, to the silence that followed. In that silence, victory was born. 4 planes returned from the 37 that departed. Through the sacrifice of the 33 who did not return, history pivoted. The sun set over a transformed Pacific that evening. The ocean held their bodies, but their names live forever in the annals of courage. They remain proof that sometimes the greatest victories are not won by those who survive. They are won by those willing to give everything when everything is required. It all began with 37 planes rising into a brilliant morning sky. It ended with the memory of those who never came home. And in between, the course of the world was changed forever.